Hey, welcome back to the Rules of Engagement. Before we jump into our second segment, let me remind you guys, if you missed any episodes of Rules of Engagement, if you want to catch up on the MLG Anaheim Spring 2013 Championships, go ahead and check out our YouTube page, youtube.com/official MLGST2. A lot of top 5, top 10 plays, comments of today's, a lot of cool content there. Whenever you get, like, you're watching a stream and they're out of a game or something, go ahead and check out the YouTube. See if there's any videos there you may be interested in. So our next segment is going to be on Hero versus Sage again from MLG Anaheim Spring 2013 Championships. And this one's going to be talking about some Proxy Stargate PvP. So first we'll talk about how the game kind of evolves when one player opens a Proxy Stargate, other player opens a normal Stargate, which is something Protoss players might be familiar with, and how to play out that situation from both sides. And also, if you have Phoenixes, the different ways to transition out of them in PvP as you get to the mid-game, and also attacking in PvP, when it's a good idea, when maybe you shouldn't, as the game gets on to the mid and later sections of the game. So we're going to start this replay off at the 4-minute mark, roughly. And we're going to notice that Sage is, of course, at the top right, Neoplanet S. He's going for that Proxy Stargate build. Let's bring it. Throw it down. Come on, Sage. There we go. Throwing that Proxy Stargate down. On the other hand, Hero at the bottom left is doing a normal Stargate opening, just with a single Stargate. And one of the big things that you can do is you scout your opponent, Hero did, and you look for the third pylon, right? So if you look for Hero's viewpoint, he went all around his opponent's base. In fact, he even missed his second pylon. So if you can't see any extra pylons, that should already give you alarm bells that your opponent may be proxying. So he's going around. He's probably going to check out some locations. Maybe he'll just check back into main later. Maybe he'll check this location for proxies. But it's something in his mind that definitely could be a possibility. Now we'll just fast forward this a little bit so we get to where stuff actually happens. Here's another scout from Sage, seeing if his opponent's expanding. And here comes the first Oracle. And now what's going to happen is, as soon as Sage gets to the base, he's going to realize this isn't good, because he runs an Oracle into 2 Phoenixes. It might get 1 or 2 probes at most. Looks like it does get 2 probes, and it's going to take it out. So this is already bad for Sage, but there's a couple things that are important to realize from Sage's point of view. One, this target should not be used. Right? If he tries to go into Phoenixes, he's already behind his opponent in Phoenixes. And if you're behind in Phoenixes, your opponent's going to just kill your Phoenixes and win the game easily. It's kind of like a mute and mirror, right? In Zerg vs. Zerg. If you're ever behind a mute account, there's no really tricky things you can do. You just have to hope you can out-macro your opponent later down the road if they get to a lot of bases. Or maybe you can build spores and transitions. That's exactly what Sage is doing. He says, you know what? I can't match his air. Not only does he already have a Phoenix lead, but his Stargate could easily be taken out, right? It's in a very vulnerable location. So instead of even trying to continue going air, immediately expanding and going for Twilight Tech, which is a great response to air play. So that's very, very smart of Sage. Now from Hero's point of view, he wants to first identify the Stargate, make sure there's not continual air production. If there was, he would produce more Phoenixes. Because there's not, he can just use it to scout and spend his initial money on counter-expanding himself. Now he knows his opponent's expanding and going Twilight Tech. He expands and gets Robotech to help deal with that Twilight Tech as the game goes on. Now what Hero does want to do is he still wants to get a few more Phoenixes, somewhere in the 3 to 4 zone. In fact, I think he actually does have, how many Phoenixes does he have? He's got 3, okay. And he wants to use this to harass his opponent. When his opponent's only defending 1 worker line, there's no real room to harass. You can use Photon Overcharge, and you're fine. And if you can't harass, you scout all around the map to find hidden pylons. And then you come back in later when the Photon Overcharge is done, or when their second base gets up and there's 2 worker lines that are vulnerable, and 1 will be a little more exposed. And of course, you want to keep stunning your opponent. And now from a Phoenix point of view, you want to start transitioning. There are some builds where you keep getting tons of Phoenixes, but generally, as soon as you have air control, right, as long as you know, okay, I have Phoenixes, and he doesn't have any Stargates. I have total air control. I mean, the Stargate's dead, right? So as long as you know you have air control, you want to start trying to transition into Colossi. And the reason why you want to go to Colossi is because really the only thing that beats Colossi that Protoss has is air units. And as long as you keep scouting your opponent, you're on top of them with your Phoenix, anytime that they start going for air units, you just resume Phoenix production and maintain the air superiority. A little bit of harass here is going to probably lose a 1. I was going to get away, so that was nice, getting a couple probes in a sentry. But you don't always want to rush instantly to Colossi. Notice how Hero hasn't started that support bait quite yet. Instead, he makes sure he has 3 gateways and a robo, and he's making sure he's trying to produce immortals. And the reason why is if you go straight to Colossi, you can be vulnerable to things like a mass blink stalker timing, a charged out Archon timing potentially, although that as long as you build buildings in a way you should be fine. Mostly a mass blink stalker timing. So you want to make sure you get a few immortals first, because your opponents, they're going to attack, they're going to be going towards Blink to defend against Phoenixes. So make sure you get a few Immortals and then go for Colossi. That's exactly what you want to do. You can see that's what Hero's doing. He's got a second Immortal out now. Usually I would get 3. It's getting more than 3. Probably that's the point where you want to start focusing more on Colossi. That's exactly what he's doing. He's getting that, where is it? He's getting the support Fae right here, and he's getting a 3rd Immortal. And after a 3rd Immortal, he'll start a Colossus. Now, as you play Colossi, in general, the later the game goes, the better it is for you, unless your opponent's going air. Because as the armies scale up, the area effect of the Colossi gets much stronger, and also the number of units in the front, the Zealots, the Archons, increases, and it makes it much more difficult for Immortals to ever get close to your Colossi. The Sage is, of course, going for Immortals and Blink Stalkers, and in small engagements, those can be okay against Colossi, but as it scales up, Colossi gets stronger and stronger. So in general, the Colossi person doesn't want to attack, but Hero does know one thing. He's been constantly scouting his opponent using some Hallucinating Phoenixes, actually tank damage, that's pretty cool, while his real Phoenixes do some nice harass. He's been constantly scouting his opponent, and he's noticed, okay, he went for the DTs, but I not taking any damage to that. I have the Observers. I also know that he's trying to get Immortals, he's trying to get Blink Stalkers, and the natural progression from that is going to be the Charge Lots and Archons. Now, when your opponent's trying to go into Charge Lots and Archons, they have two possible. Well, they have to get charged, first of all, which is very expensive. And then second of all, they either have to also get a Templar Archives or build Archons using Dark Templar. And Dark Templar are very expensive Archons. You spend 500 resources for an Archon. That's the same you'd spend on an Ultralisk, which is a much stronger unit. At least if you're only worried about ground units. So he knows that there's all these things Sage is going to be spending money on. And then he also knows that he had an early lead because of the Proxy Oracle did nothing, and then he's been able to do some damage to the Phoenix Harass, mostly because Sage didn't have good defenses because the Proxy Oracle didn't do any damage, and he went for Dark Templar as well. So Hero knows he's a little bit ahead. He knows that it's going to be a lot of investment for Sage trying to transition to Charge at Archon. Now he has the Blink Stalkers, he can defend against Phoenix, but he needs to get Charge at Archon to really make an army that can actually compete with Colossi at all. And these things say, you know what, I'm going to go for timing. And he's seen this ahead of time, and so he never got range for the Colossi. Or the Colossus, in fact, there's only one of them. Instead, he actually just built a single Colossus, and then he added a lot more gateways. Look at this, he's already gone up to 6 gateways here. He's getting a Twilight Council so he can eventually transition to Archons himself. And the reason he's anticipating Archons is because he's mostly going to be warping in Zealots in the battles. Maybe a few Stalks, there's too much air, but in general, mostly Zealot warpings. And that's, of course, the reason why he's not really building any more Colossus into his armies, because if he does so, that's 500 resources being spent in this Robo that's not going to be right here for this attack. And this is an attack that, in general, you don't want to do. You don't want to go for Colossi and attack an opponent who's on low-tech units. But if you know you had a small early lead, because your opponent tried to proxy Stargate, didn't do anything, and you got some nice Phoenix Harass, that's one factor that says, okay, I'm a little bit ahead. Now, if I'm a little bit ahead, I can do multiple things. One, I can just take a 3rd base. And if I take a 3rd base, I'll still be a little bit ahead. If he takes a 3rd base, then I'll still be a little bit ahead from the opening. But then if you both max out, that advantage can go away. But sometimes you're not ahead enough to do an attack, so that's what you want to do. Just take a 3rd base and use your advantage, maybe tech for late game. Start going for maybe Tempest or a lot of Colossi, some super late game army. But if you're a little bit ahead and you know your opponent is going to be teching fast, right? You know he's going to be going for charge. He's going to be going for an attack upgrade. Then it's good to attack. And in fact, when Sage saw this attack coming, he had to cancel charge, knowing he had no time to get it. And then without charge, there's no real way to deal with the Immortals and Colossi from Hero. His Phoenixes can come in here, and if they deal with it, pick up a couple Immortals, Sage's army is almost entirely Blink Stalkers. So even though the armies are very close in resource value, Sage's army is mostly Blink Stalkers. And Stalkers are, for Protoss versus any race, Stalkers are always the worst unit for cost to battle effectiveness ratio that you can have, right? So Stalkers are very useful for skirmishing, they're fast, they're versatile. We're talking about the amount of resources they cost to its life and damage and battle effectiveness. Stalkers are one of the very weakest units in the game from any race, and at least for Protoss, they're your weakest one. So if you ever have equal resources in your Stalker-heavy army, you're going to lose the battle. Unless it's some very small battle where you can abuse the mobility and micro of Stalkers, right? So that's why early game people do Blink Stalker rushes, they use Stalkers in PvP early game, But in mid-game battles where you can't really, the fancy micro tricks can't make that big of a difference, that's when if you're Stalker heavy, you're going to be losing in battles, unless you're ahead, which sometimes you will be if you play the early game out well with Stalkers. So we're going to jump back in this battle and to see that even though it's equal resources, and Phoenixes in fact aren't the greatest units in this type of engagement, it's still a situation where it's a lot of Stalkers versus a very mixed composition. You know, Immortals, Colossus, Sentries even are much more effective than Stalkers that do the force fields in here. And you can just overwhelm his opponent because now, I mean, now you can look at the resources, he's getting higher and higher, just because the Stalkers can't actually kill anything. Right? They can pick off maybe one Immortal here, but they're all going to die trying to do so. So here goes ahead and wins this game. I mean, we'll fast forward to the next minute or two, building a Proxy Nexus there, just to taunt his opponent, and finishing us off in a nice little mouse style there. But a couple of things that are really cool about this game for PvP is to note. One is, if you're going Proxy Stargate and you run into Phoenixes, don't rage quit the game. Like you saw, yes, Stage lost this game, but it actually wasn't that lopsided. The last battle looked lopsided because there was a very small weakness before Charge finished and he gave the Archons in the front that he was vulnerable. But if you're doing Proxy Stargate, it doesn't do anything, abandon it. If your opponent's going Phoenixes, you just expand, go into Blink Stalkers and into Charge out Archon. And if your opponent isn't hero, you know, they might not recognize a tiny weakness you have, and if they don't attack you right then, all of a sudden you've got, you know, Immortal, Stalker, Charge out Archon, a pretty good army, and the game goes on. You're not going to be ahead, but it's going to be very, very close, hard-fought game going forward. So Proxy Stargate, if you run to Phoenixes, don't worry about you're behind, but you can make it back up and immediately expand and go to Blink Stalkers. From the other side, if you're a Phoenix player, once you have air control, you almost always want to go to Colossi. And then generally you want to play passive if your opponent's standing low tech, but if you notice them trying to tech too fast, Colossi are a great unit to try to hit a timing attack very early, because all you need is a single Colossus, and all of a sudden you can break all your opponent's force fields, and you can use your own force fields yourself to great benefit. So a couple notes there in PvP if you run into this situation, Proxy Stargates, or even just Phoenix control in general, whenever you have the map control, go for those Colossi. So wraps up our second segment. We'll take a short break and be right into our third segment, a match between the Muslim and Sasquatch.